about Justin Welby now. He told the BBC he forgives a serial abuser at the heart of a scandal that led to his resignation as the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is the first interview, actually, that he's given since he quit in November of last year. He said his forgiveness of John Smyth, arguably the most prolific abuser associated with the Church of England, was irrelevant, and it was more important to help victims rebuild their lives. Just to remind you, Smyth died in 2018. He attacked more than 100 boys and young men in the UK and Africa over decades. There was a damning report in 2024, and it found that Justin Welby could, and I'm quoting, could and should have done more to bring Smyth to justice, which the former Archbishop says he feels a deep sense of personal failure over. Well, joining me now is Rabbi Dr Jonathan Romain, MBE, who's a broadcaster and social campaigner. Good afternoon to you. What are your initial thoughts on this? The first interview that Justin Welby has given, he said he forgives the Church of England serial paedophile John Smyth. Just before you answer that, let's listen to him speaking to Laura Koonsberg on the BBC about his resignation.
It did cause profound upset, and I am profoundly ashamed of that, and I apologised within 24 hours, and I remain deeply ashamed. It's one of those moments where, when I think of it, I just wince. It was entirely wrong and entirely inexcusable.
What were you thinking?
I wasn't in a good space at the time. I shouldn't have done a valedictory speech at all.
Jonathan, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's good that he admits responsibility, because obviously it was a blot on both the church and his personal career, because he'd had a sort of a very good reputation up to that point. My first thought when I heard that he said he would forgive John Smyth I was really taken aback, actually, because although on the one hand it does sound, quite noble, but I thought, well, goodness gracious me, what is the effect of those words, I forgive John Smyth, on the victims? How will they feel, particularly because they felt so ignored, almost like double abused, firstly by John Smyth and then by the church not listening in the way it should have done. And then the other thought was, my goodness, actually, it's not your call. You can't forgive somebody else on behalf of other people. The only people who can forgive a perpetrator are the victims themselves. So it was very nice of him to say those words, but actually it doesn't really count for much. And I think he sort of admitted that when he said it's irrelevant, because it's only the people a person abused who can actually give that forgiveness.
I think you're absolutely right. What he did was utterly abhorrent to those young men and boys. It is not up to Justin Welby to forgive. It is up to those people who were abused at the hands of Smyth. And actually, when you read some of the testimonials from Smyth's victims, there's one here from Graham. He made a complaint in 2013. He said he would never forgive Welby. He said in 2017, if he had contacted us and said, I will come up and apologise to you personally, I'm sorry, I messed up, this is Welby, I would have forgiven him immediately, but he never has, and he never has on those terms.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, in a slight mitigation of Welby, I sort of know what he feels like, because I also been in that situation where I worked with somebody for many years, trusted them, respected them, and then found out that they were actually a child abuser. And I can remember the sense of shock and betrayal, so I can quite understand why Welby was so personally hurt, and maybe he can forgive John Smyth for the way that it sort of led to Welby's own downfall. But as we both said, it's only the victims. And that really begs an interesting question, doesn't it? Is even the victims, can they just willy-nilly sort of forgive John Smyth, or anybody actually, because he's dead, or does it have to be earned? In other words, does the person have to first of all admit their guilt, then show repentance, then apologise, certainly face judicial action, whether it's a prison sentence or a fine or a community service, whatever's appropriate? In other words, is forgiveness something you just dole out because it's on your conscience, or does it actually have to be earned by the perpetrator first?
So this was the 2024 Makin report. It said his brutal abuse, this is Smyth, was on an industrial scale, concluded opportunities to investigate Smyth over his abuse were missed, including when evidence was presented to Welby in 2013. So we're talking about 11 years where Welby knew he had evidence, did nothing about it, and so you have someone who is influential in the church who is essentially protecting and covering the church.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing good to say about it. That's why he paid the penalty of not only losing his job, but also having the disgrace. So I think the first person in, 1,000 years, Archbishop, to be jettisoned from office. I mean, it's really quite unheard of, and he's going to live with that for the rest of his days. Just to go back on something we talked about, David, this idea of only victims can forgive and whether it has to be earned or not. There is another aspect to this, is that sometimes, and I've seen this in person, a victim can forgive the perpetrator even though they haven't apologised, because it's a way of sort of letting go. In other words, it's not justice, but it means that victim is not necessarily carrying the anger, the resentment, like an albatross around their neck, and it doesn't poison the rest of their life. And so that's almost like having a double penalty, not only the initial abuse that you suffered, but then letting it sort of control the rest of your life as well. And if you can at least stop it where it ended and not carry it through for the rest of your career, your life, your relationships, and you want to let go, then I think it would be justified to forgive somebody without them actually even admitting guilt. But
well, you touch on something really important here, which is he has destroyed the lives of these 120 young men and boys. And of course, the impact of that, and many of them will remain silent about what happened and the ramifications of that, the denting of their emotional relationships, their social relationships, their interpersonal relationships. And of course, you mention forgiveness there, but actually, isn't it for many of those victims trying to come to terms with it, to try and move on in their lives?
Yes, that's totally right. They've got to try and put it behind them. Now, whether that means forgiving him in their hearts, of course, if he was still alive, there'd be no question about trying to extradite him from wherever he went. I think it was Australia, wasn't it?
It was.
And bringing him to justice in this court. But perhaps because he's dead, the real message from this is to anybody watching this programme right now: if you know of somebody who is abusing but is not being brought to light, speak out. You've got to speak out, both for the sake of the people he has or she has already abused, and also for those that they may go on to abuse. With this abuse case in the church has actually been going on, as you said, a very long time, and people are still getting away with it. We've got to stop them escaping justice.
And that's a really good point. What is it about these institutions like the church where abuse seems to be tolerated? It seems to be endemic. We hear case after case after case and nothing is done. What is it about those institutions, like the church, for example, that seems to protect the predator?
Yes, it's actually very strange because, of course, it's not just the church, is it?
No.
I mean, all institutions, and I don't want to say that other faiths don't have abusers, whether it's rabbis or imams or whatever, and within the police or even in, bosses in businesses, everybody, unfortunately, is prone to it. But somehow the church has been a hotbed, almost a safety net for people to hide and abuse. And obviously it's partly to do with authority. And it's not just the authority of having a peak cat like a boss does, but the authority of God, the big boss in the sky, so to speak. And that maybe gives them the power to do things. But somehow, but you could say that about so many things in the probation service, in the scouts, and yes, there are rotten apples here and there, but somehow there seems to be, basket loads of rotten apples in the church. And if I was a vicar, I would be quite ashamed of what some of my fellow priests were doing.
Do you think there's a problem here? Because if it's in any other sector of public life, there would be an inquiry, it would be an external inquiry, and we would have the conclusions drawn from that. Is part of the problem that actually the church marks its own homework, so it investigates any potential abuse, it decides what the punishment will be, and actually last month the General Synod, which is the governing body, as you know, of the Church of England, rejected a proposal that would have made safeguarding fully independent. Surely that is only the beginning of this conversation.
You're spot on, and it's really quite extraordinary that the church didn't allow outside investigation in the way that it should have. If this had been the very first week of such cases, they could have dismissed it of, oh, well, it's a one-off. But as you say, it's been 20 years or more, and certainly even the Catholic Church, both here and in Ireland, it just been one story after another. And you'd have thought by now they would have got the message. And what that vote in Synod, which didn't allow external authority to come in, shows that the Church, or certainly the hierarchy, has not yet got the message that abuse is wrong and that somehow they are covering it up. And this is perhaps why a lot of people, sadly, have left the Church. I say sadly because most vicars actually do a tremendous job on very low pay, against the odds, overworked, and are there for all sorts of people in their local parish. But the institution itself has got something rotten at the centre.
Just in terms of that, we're seeing falling congregations in the Church of England. We're seeing a shift, as I mentioned, actually, the demographic fabric making up this country. We're seeing that. We're seeing the Church of England. You mentioned their vicars not being paid very much, but actually the Church of England is a massive landowner, has a lot of money. What lessons does the Church need to do? Also, what does the Church, and I will focus on the Church, need to do to restore trust from the public?
Well, with the one caveat that it's not just the Church.
No, indeed.
Everybody else is blameless, and we've all got rogue rabbis or whatever. They have to have a new leader who doesn't come from the sort of rather tired, institutionalized leaders that they have at the moment. They've got to have a completely new brush, who's not tarnished, and who can really... It doesn't need to be a theologian. It just needs to be someone with common sense who can look at the Church and say, we've got to change, and who can make it change. Now, to give slight credit to Welby, he did try and do certain things. So it's not as if he ignored everything. He may have ignored Smyth and other cases, but he was aware of the problem. But he wasn't aware enough, and he didn't move fast enough. Someone's going to have to make a really big change to the way the Church operates and is perceived to operate, because it's not just a matter of doing things behind closed doors. It's got to show the public that it's woken up to the problem and it's going to do something about it. That would be the case in any other realm of this country, in business or other public bodies. The Church has got to do the same, and it's really strange that somehow it hasn't done that so far.